The first thing that struck the traveler was the silence. St. Helena's Academy stood at the edge of a small town in Massachusetts, an enormous structure of gray stone rising like a fortress against the wind. Its windows were narrow slits, too tall for children to look through, and the great iron gates at its entrance were taller still, bars so thick that no child could ever slip between them. Outsiders saw the gates as symbols of safety, a wall to protect vulnerable orphans from a hostile world. But for the children who lived inside, those gates were not protection. They were a sentence. Once the locks turned, the world outside might as well have been a dream. The building was old, its stones blackened by soot from years of coal smoke, and its roof cut the sky like the sharp edge of a coffin lid. The walls carried no sound, no laughter, no signs of childhood. What little sound escaped was the droning hymn of voices rising each morning and fading at dusk. A sound so heavy it felt less like worship and more like surrender. Townsfolk sometimes paused to listen, calling it beautiful, never knowing that within those voices trembled the strain of fear. St. Helena's was founded with noble words, to house, educate, and protect orphans who had no families to love them. Pamphlets circulated in nearby towns showing smiling children holding hands under the watchful care of kind sisters. Donors saw photographs of neat dormitories, shining dining halls, and orderly classrooms. No one photographed the basements. No one described the smell of mildew mixed with iron or the faint copper sting that sometimes clung to the air after nightfall. The gates stood tall to project dignity, but they also hid the shadows gathering just beyond their bars. Children arrived at the academy from all over New England, each with their own small tragedy. Some lost parents to illness, others abandoned at workhouses, still others delivered by desperate relatives who could not afford to keep them. When the gates closed behind them, their names were written in careful ledgers, their old belongings taken away, their identities stripped until they belonged not to themselves but to St. Helena's. Every child became the same, an orphan under the care of the sisters, each wearing identical uniforms, each marched into the same routines of prayer, study, and work. Yet those who passed under the gates felt something heavier than discipline. The younger ones cried in their beds the first nights, only to be hushed into silence by older children who had already learned the rule. Crying brought attention, and attention led to punishment. Soon the new arrivals learned to swallow their voices, their tears, their very sense of self. It was as though the iron gates had swallowed their pasts and now demanded their futures. The town saw St. Helena's as a place of order in a world of chaos. They heard stories of unruly children made obedient, of orphans given education and faith. Parents warned their own sons and daughters to behave, or else they would end up behind the gates. To the outside world, the academy became less an orphanage and more a fabled institution of discipline. The sisters wore their habits like armor, and their smiles in public gatherings became their shield. No one questioned their methods. Why would they? The sisters were seen as holy women, vessels of sacrifice who had given up their lives for children who had nothing. But behind those gates, evil moved not in loud bursts, but in silence. It seeped through the hallways like dampness, slow, invisible, and permanent. And for the 73 children who would never live to leave those walls, the iron gates were not the beginning of salvation. They were the first bars of a prison designed for suffering, the first step toward an end no one dared to imagine. If St. Helena's had a face, it was Sister Agnes. To the town, she was the gentle matron, her eyes bright with kindness, her lips curved in a smile that seemed to promise safety. She walked with slow, measured grace, often stopping to kneel and speak tenderly with children in the courtyard whenever visitors came. She held their hands as though she were a mother and laughed softly as though nothing in the world could harm them. When donors toured the grounds, she would press a hand to her chest and speak of sacrifice, of the calling to serve those who had no families. Every movement of hers was polished, careful, deliberate. To outsiders, she was the saint of the gates. But the children knew something else. They had seen her smile change when no one was looking. In public, her smile lifted and warmed, but in the dark halls of the dormitories, that smile stretched thinner, longer, becoming a mask. When her eyes narrowed, the smile remained fixed, but it no longer meant kindness. It was a warning. The younger children learned quickly the smile meant obedience, and disobedience meant pain. Sister Agnes had a method for everything. She believed that to shape a child, one must first erase their sense of self. She spoke often of the human soul as a blank slate, insisting that the orphanage's purpose was not simply to raise children, but to reform them, rebuild them, make them worthy. Her favorite phrase was repeated so often that it rang in the children's ears even as they tried to sleep. A crooked branch must be broken before it can grow straight. Her punishments were not impulsive, not bursts of temper. They were measured, tested, and refined. When a child wet the bed, Agnes did not strike them. She ordered them to scrub the floors on their hands and knees all day while wearing wet sheets tied around their shoulders like cloaks, the cold seeping into their skin until their teeth rattled. If another child stuttered during recitation, she demanded they spend the evening reading aloud into a darkened mirror, their own reflection staring back at them as their voices cracked and failed. Each punishment was not about discipline alone. It was about breaking something deeper, stripping away pride, fear, even the thought of resistance. Her fellow sisters followed her commands without question. Some believed truly that Agnes's methods were divine. Others simply obeyed because obedience was easier than doubt. A few looked away in silence, their own guilt becoming part of the institution's walls. None stopped her. None dared. And so her system of cruelty spread like a shadow over every hallway, every dormitory, every classroom of St. Helena's. The children feared her more than the gates. The gates, at least, were honest. They trapped the body, nothing more. Sister Agnes trapped the soul. She watched with unblinking patience, studying each child as if they were specimens. She knew which ones would break quickly, which ones resisted, which ones whispered at night when they thought no one was listening. Her punishments adapted to the child in front of her, personal and intimate, so that each one felt uniquely targeted, uniquely destroyed. Still, when visitors came, she returned to her mask. She strolled the grounds with donors, showing them well-polished desks and neat beds. She spoke proudly of children's hymns echoing through the chapel. Sometimes she would single out one of the younger orphans, lifting them into her arms with a smile for the cameras, the image of a holy woman holding the abandoned. That child would not be seen again for days. When they returned, their eyes carried something heavy, a silence too old for their age. The town never doubted her. How could they? She was a woman of faith, cloaked in black and white, who spoke only of sacrifice and devotion. They could not imagine that the same hands which blessed children's heads in public also tightened straps in hidden chambers below. They did not see the ledger in her private study, its neat handwriting tracking punishments like recipes, each one adjusted for precision, each one tested for effect. Her smile lingered in every child's mind, not as comfort, but as a nightmare they carried into their sleep. The matron's smile was the face of St. Helena's, and it was a face that hid the truth more completely than the gates themselves. It began quietly, as most things did within the walls of St. Helena's. At first it seemed no different from the usual routines. Children gathered for morning prayer, lined up for porridge, marched into classrooms under the watchful eyes of the sisters. But then the bell rang at an unusual hour. Sister Agnes appeared in the doorway of the dining hall, her hands folded neatly, her voice steady as she announced that some of the children had been chosen for special lessons. Her words were soft, almost musical, yet the air inside the hall grew heavy. The younger ones shifted nervously on the benches while the older ones lowered their eyes. They knew what it meant. The chosen names were read aloud with deliberate slowness. Each child called forward carried a look of confusion or dread, their small hands trembling as they left the table. Agnes smiled and touched their shoulders, reassuring the onlookers with words about discipline and growth. The sisters led them away through the side corridor, down toward the stairwell that led beneath the academy. The others watched them go in silence, each holding their breath, each wondering if tomorrow it might be their name called. The children who returned from these lessons were never the same. They walked slower, their eyes dulled, their voices hushed as if they had been taught that speaking itself was dangerous. Some bore faint marks on their skin, bruises that did not come from accidents, scratches that no play could explain. When questioned by their peers in whispers, they gave no answers. Their silence was deeper than fear. It was as if words themselves had been stolen from them. Others did not return at all. Their beds sat empty in the dormitories, their names unspoken. The sisters explained these absences with vague assurances. The child had been sent to another orphanage or taken in by a family. The stories shifted each time. The children noticed. The silence around it grew. Whispers spread at night between bunks. Some said the chosen children were punished until their minds broke. Others whispered of rituals in the dark chambers below, where prayers were mixed with cruelty and blood was taken as proof of devotion. The rumors twisted into nightmares so that even sleep became dangerous. The children learned not to speak too loudly of these fears, for the walls had ears, and Sister Agnes had a way of knowing when rules were broken, even in whispers. The selections became part of life inside St. Helena's. Every few weeks the bell rang and names were called. Each time the children sat straighter, prayed harder, obeyed without hesitation, as though perfect obedience might shield them from being chosen. But nothing stopped it. No matter how perfectly they folded their uniforms or recited their hymns, the names came anyway. The randomness was the cruelty. There was no way to prepare, no way to resist. Each child lived in the shadow of the next selection, knowing that at any moment they might be pulled into the dark corridors and never come back. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. Visitors came and left, impressed with the order of the academy. Donors praised the sisters for their discipline, remarking on how well-behaved the children were, how silent and obedient they seemed. They mistook terror for respect, silence for piety. They never wondered why the children's smiles never reached their eyes. They never asked about the missing faces. The first selections were the quiet beginning of what would become the Academy's darkest legacy. In the silence of those empty beds, in the faint smell of damp stone that clung to the air after each disappearance, something irreversible had begun. The children felt it but could not speak it. The walls of St. Helena's had swallowed their voices, and soon it would swallow them too. Beneath St. Helena's Academy lay a world the children were never meant to see. The stairwell leading down was narrow and cold, its steps worn by years of secret use yet never spoken of aloud. The sisters referred to it only as the lower rooms, as if it were no more than storage for coal or linens. But the children who were chosen and led down those stairs returned with shadows in their eyes, and those who never returned became whispers on the lips of the others. At the bottom of the stairwell stretched a long corridor lined with stone, the kind that sweated with dampness and smelled of earth. The walls bore strange markings, carved shallow but precise, not random scratches but symbols. Some resembled crosses, others resembled letters twisted beyond recognition, as though faith itself had been rewritten. The children did not understand them, but Sister Agnes did. She often paused to touch them with her fingertips, as if drawing strength from the carvings before unlocking the heavy doors at the corridor's end. The chamber itself was vast, larger than the chapel above. Its ceiling arched high, supported by pillars blackened from candle smoke. The air carried the sharp tang of iron mixed with mildew and something sweetly foul that lingered in the nose. Chains dangled from the walls, their ends polished smooth from use. Along the sides of the room were wooden tables, their surfaces stained in ways no scrubbing could erase. At the center stood a raised platform, shaped like an altar but stripped of holiness, built not to worship God but to worship control. The children brought here learned quickly that nothing inside the chamber was random. Each object had a purpose, and every punishment was rehearsed as though it were a lesson in a cruel science. Sister Agnes treated the chamber as her laboratory, experimenting not with chemicals or medicines, but with the limits of suffering. She recorded her observations meticulously in her ledgers. How long a child could endure standing without food, how silence could be forced when threats failed, how fear could reshape the body as surely as hunger. Her cruelty was not the rage of a cruel woman. It was the calculation of someone who saw pain as a craft. The chamber below was not hidden out of shame. It was hidden because it revealed too much truth. To the children, it was a place where time dissolved. They entered as themselves, trembling, clinging to hope, and they emerged hollow, carrying only silence. Those who disappeared entirely seemed to dissolve into the stones themselves, their absence becoming part of the chamber's walls, absorbed into the dampness and the carvings. Whispers spread through the dormitories about the chamber. Some children described hearing footsteps beneath the floor at night. pacing endlessly as though the chamber was alive, even when empty. Others swore they smelled the iron and mildew rising through the cracks in the chapel above. No one dared to speak openly, but everyone knew. The chamber below was where children ceased to be children. The sisters who assisted Agnes rarely spoke of their role. They moved like shadows, their faces blank, their hands steady. Some believed they were as much victims as the children, bound by obedience and fear of Agnes herself. Others perhaps believed in her vision. Whatever their reasons, they never resisted. Together they made the chamber below not an accident of history, but a living machine of cruelty, turning slowly, devouring child after child. To the world outside, St. Helena's was a school of discipline and faith. But beneath its stones in the chamber that smelled of iron and mildew, a different truth lived and thrived. It was a truth no prayer could sanctify, no smile could disguise. The children who descended those stairs entered into silence, and that silence grew into the legend of the 73 who never came back. For Sister Agnes, silence was more than discipline. It was devotion. She believed that God's voice could only be heard when every human sound was extinguished. To her, a quiet orphan was a holy orphan, stripped of doubt, stripped of self, reduced to an empty vessel that reflected only obedience. But silence imposed through fear was never enough for her. She sought something deeper, something permanent, a silence that became part of the body itself. The experiment began with rules. Children were forbidden to whisper in their dormitories after lights out. They were forbidden to laugh during meals or to cry during punishments. Every word spoken without permission was counted as a sin. At first, the punishments for disobedience were simple: extra chores, meals withheld, long hours of kneeling on the stone floor. But Agnes observed with sharp eyes that fear of punishment could only hold them for so long. Whispers continued, muffled sobs still broke through the dark. She wanted more, so the experiments grew harsher. Children who spoke out of turn were ordered to wear thick leather gags that pressed into their jaws until their lips split. Some were forced to hold water in their mouths for hours, unable to swallow while their bodies trembled with effort. Others were bound in closets with nothing but silence, left alone so long they began to whisper to themselves just to feel real. Agnes recorded it all, adjusting, refining, searching for the perfect method to erase sound. And then came the most terrible refinement of all. She began to sew. The chosen children were taken into the chamber below and laid across wooden benches. Their lips were pierced with sharp needles threaded with black cord, pulled tight until their mouths sealed shut. Some thrashed in panic, muffled cries leaking from between their teeth before the stitches closed. Others lay still, too paralyzed by terror to resist. When the yabu thread knotted, silence was no longer a rule or a punishment. It was a prison stitched into their own flesh. Agnes called it mercy. She told her fellow sisters that it would free the children from temptation, that without tongues to betray them, they could serve God more purely. To the children it was unspeakable horror. They watched their friends return from the chamber with swollen faces, eyes swollen from tears, mouths sealed with crude black lines that turned smiles into grotesque scars. Those who carried the stitches survived on broth sipped through straws, their hunger as constant as their humiliation. The silence spread like an infection. Even those untouched by the needle fell quiet, terrified that any word could bring the same fate. The dormitories became graveyards of breath, the classrooms filled with the scratching of chalk, but never laughter, never questions. For Sister Agnes this was triumph. For the children it was the sound of their own disappearance. Some of the stitched mouths festered, the thread cut into skin, swelling until fever followed. A few children died, their silence made eternal. Their bodies vanished without ceremony, their names never spoken again. The others learned that survival meant swallowing every word, every sob, every cry. The academy no longer needed locks or chains to enforce obedience. The silence itself was enough. In the town beyond the gates, visitors remarked on how peaceful St. Helena's had become. They marveled at the discipline of the children, the quiet orderliness that seemed to radiate holiness. They praised Sister Agnes for her devotion, never knowing that the silence they admired was bought with thread, blood, and the stolen voices of 73 forgotten children. Sister Agnes's obsession did not stop with silence. Once she had taken the voices of children, she turned her mind toward their reflections. She believed that every soul must face itself before it could be purified, that the truest terror lay not in pain inflicted by others but in watching oneself dissolve beneath it. To make this vision real, she commissioned a carpenter from a nearby town under false pretenses, ordering what she described as a teaching device for science. What he delivered, never knowing its true purpose, was a coffin of glass. It was a rectangular chamber, its walls made of thick panes held together with iron frames. The lid opened on a hinge, sealing with a metal clasp. At first glance, it might have seemed like a display case, the kind used in museums. But Agnes had designed it for something darker. Beneath the coffin was a spout connected to buckets of water, allowing the chamber to be filled gradually, inch by inch, while the child inside remained trapped, forced to watch the slow approach of drowning. The coffin was transparent not for beauty but for cruelty. The first child chosen for the experiment was small, barely 10 years old, their body thin from hunger and long punishment. They were placed gently inside as if it were no more than another lesson. The lid closed with a hollow click. At first there was only the echo of their breathing, quick and shallow, fogging the glass. Then the water began to flow. It rose slowly, just enough to cover their feet, then their ankles. The child stared at their reflection, distorted in the glass, their wide eyes staring back. They pressed their palms against the walls, watching themselves from all sides, trapped in a mirror of terror. The water climbed to their knees, then their chest. They gasped, every breath echoing loudly in the chamber until the sound was swallowed by the rising water. By the time it reached their neck, their reflection showed not a child, but a drowning figure, mouth open in a scream that no one could hear. Other children were forced to stand nearby, commanded to watch. Sister Agnes whispered to them that this was a lesson, that in witnessing the reflection of another's suffering they might learn obedience without needing to endure it themselves. The child inside the coffin thrashed until their body grew weak, their movements slowing as the water covered their face. The last thing the onlookers saw was the reflection of eyes wide in panic before the body sank still. The water settled, rippling with final silence. Agnes ordered the coffin drained. The child's body was removed, limp and pale, and carried into the chamber's shadows, never to be seen again. The experiment did not end there. The coffin became a tool, a ritual. Sometimes the water was filled to the neck, then drained before death, leaving the child trembling and broken, haunted by their own reflection of near drowning. Other times it was filled completely, the coffin left standing like a glass grave until the chosen child ceased moving. The survivors were never survivors in truth. They returned hollow, their eyes unable to meet their own reflection ever again. The coffin itself became an object of dread among the children. Its glass panes glistened faintly in candlelight, reflecting every tremor of fear on the faces of those forced to approach it. Even those who were never placed inside carried the weight of it in their dreams, waking at night gasping for air as though the water still pressed against their throats. The coffin taught them that escape was impossible, that their own bodies and their own reflections could not be trusted. In the outside world, the Academy's reputation grew. Donors praised the sisters for instilling discipline, for shaping silent, obedient children into models of devotion. They never knew that beneath the Academy, obedience was taught through drowning glass, that innocence was broken not by chance but by method, carefully observed and repeated until 73 children disappeared forever. The coffin remained polished after each use, its glass wiped clean, though the stains of small palms never truly faded. It stood as both instrument and monument, a testament to Sister Agnes's belief that suffering, when made visible, could reshape the soul. To the children it was a coffin in truth, a grave that reflected their own faces back at them, a reminder that at St. Helena's, even your reflection could become your executioner. When the glass coffin was not in use, Sister Agnes sought a different kind of ritual, one that did not break the body but reshaped the soul. She turned her attention to sound, not the sound of rebellion or laughter, which she despised, but the sound of devotion forced out of ruined voices. The orphan choir became her nightly masterpiece. At first it seemed innocent. Music had always been part of the Academy's routine. Hymns filled the chapel every morning and evening. But under Agnes's control, the singing grew darker, stripped of joy, reduced to something closer to wailing than worship. She gathered the children who had survived her punishments, the ones who had been gagged, stitched, or locked in silence, and ordered them to sing. Their voices were hoarse, broken by infection or scar tissue, yet she demanded perfection. Every note was tested, corrected, beaten into them until obedience itself became a melody. Children with stitched mouths were forced to hum through thread and swollen lips. Their muffled tones mixed with the rasps of others who had nearly drowned in the glass coffin. Agnes called these voices sacred, claiming that suffering gave their hymns a holiness ordinary voices lacked. She made the choir perform not for the children's comfort, but for her private obsession. In her ledgers she wrote of tones achieved only under duress, of pitches drawn from lungs tightened by fear. She was not collecting music. She was collecting the sound of agony dressed in robes of devotion. The choir gathered in the chapel after dusk, the air heavy with candle smoke. Rows of children stood in perfect formation, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar. When the first note left their throats, it was not joy that filled the room, but despair sharpened into harmony. Their voices trembled, cracked, blended into a chorus that carried no childhood innocence, only the weight of everything they had endured. Agnes stood in the shadows, listening, her eyes closed as though the voices were feeding something deep inside her. The children learned that mistakes brought consequences. If a note was missed or a hymn sung too weakly, the singer was pulled from the line and taken below. Sometimes they returned days later, their voices raspier, their eyes hollow. Sometimes they never returned at all. Each absence deepened the terror in the remaining voices, tightening their throats, giving the choir a sound that was less music than mourning. The orphan choir became a nightly spectacle for the sisters themselves. They sat in the pews, silent, hands folded, listening as though the broken voices were a sermon. Some looked away, unable to bear it, while others nodded as if convinced that obedience made the music holy. For Sister Agnes, the choir proved her belief. Silence could be made absolute, but sound, when forced from pain, could be reshaped into something divine. To the town beyond the gates, the choir was a miracle. On special feast days, selected donors were invited to hear the children sing. They marveled at the discipline, at the haunting beauty of the hymns, never realizing that the beauty they admired was born of suffering. Parents returned home telling neighbors how angelic the orphans of St. Helena's sounded, how pure their faith must be. None of them saw the scars inside the mouths that produced those hymns, or the silent fear that vibrated behind every note. For the children, the choir was not worship. It was a nightly reminder that even their pain could be stolen and turned into ritual. They sang not for God, not for hope, but because the sound of their broken voices was all they had left to give. And in the echoes of those hymns, St. Helena's held onto its silence, a silence disguised as song. It was in the spring of 1873 when the silence of St. Helena's thickened into something irreversible. By then the choir had become routine, the glass coffin had been used more than once, and the chamber below was as much a part of the academy as the classrooms above. Yet nothing prepared the orphans for what would come that year. 73 children entered the season alive. 73 would not see its end. It began with a shift so subtle that the town noticed nothing at all. Letters stopped being sent on behalf of the children. For years, Sister Agnes had allowed carefully written notes to be delivered to priests, officials, and donors, a gesture to prove the Academy's transparency. But one day, the letters stopped, and no one questioned why. Instead, families who once sent inquiries received polite notices that the children had been adopted or transferred to other institutions. The handwriting was neat, the tone calm, but the children named in those letters were never seen again. Inside the academy, the disappearances became routine. Beds emptied one after another, the sheets folded neatly by the sisters as though the child had never slept there. Desks sat unused, names were erased from roll calls, belongings burned in the furnace. For the children who remained, each absence was a wound with no explanation. At night, whispers spread through the dormitories. Some said the missing had been drowned in the coffin, their bodies dissolved into the chamber below. Others whispered of fires lit deep in the academy where smoke carried fragments of bone into the night sky. No one dared to speak loudly enough for the sisters to hear. By mid-year, the number of empty beds grew impossible to ignore. Entire rows in the dormitories were vacant. The choir thinned until their hymns echoed with gaps broken by the silence of missing voices. Those who survived were forced to sing louder, to cover the void left behind, their voices shaking under the weight of absence. Sister Agnes wrote in her ledger with clinical precision, recording each child not with names but with symbols: a circle for silence, a wave for drowning, a flame for ash. To her, they were no longer children. They were outcomes of experiments. The survivors carried guilt as much as fear. Each time the bell rang for selection, they wondered if obedience had saved them or condemned them. Some tried to be invisible, shrinking into shadows in the hope that the sisters would forget them. Others prayed with desperate fervor, convinced that faith alone might protect them. But no prayer altered the pattern. The disappearances continued relentless until the number 73 carved itself into the Academy's history like a scar. The town outside still saw perfection. Visitors walked the halls on feast days, hearing hymns from the choir and watching orderly classrooms. They never counted the children. They saw neat rows, polished shoes, tidy uniforms, and assumed nothing had changed. The sisters explained the smaller numbers with lies polished smooth by practice. Adopted into good families, sent to another diocese, given opportunities beyond our walls, and because no one looked closer, the world accepted it. But within the Academy, the truth could not be hidden. The children who remained felt the walls closing tighter with every loss. They noticed the silence in their dormitories, the empty seats at meals, the gaps in their prayers. They felt the weight of being the ones left behind, haunted by the certainty that one day their names would be called and their beds stripped clean like all the others. By the end of 1873, St. Helena's had devoured 73 children. Their absence was never marked with funerals, never mourned with prayers. Their names were scratched out of ledgers, their faces forgotten by the outside world. Only the surviving children remembered, and even their memories grew poisoned by silence, for they knew speaking of the vanished could bring them closer to joining them. The vanishing of 1873 became the Academy's darkest secret, buried beneath polite smiles and holy hymns. For the world, St. Helena's stood untouched, a fortress of discipline and faith. But for those inside, it had become something else entirely. A place where children did not graduate, did not grow, did not leave. They disappeared one by one until the number 73 became less a statistic and more a curse whispered in the dark. When word reached St. Helena's that a bishop was coming for inspection, the sisters moved with sudden purpose. Floors were scrubbed until their stones gleamed, windows polished until they reflected the gray sky, and every surviving child was drilled to perfection. The Academy, hollowed by 73 vanishings, had to appear untouched, holy, and thriving. Sister Agnes orchestrated it like a general preparing for war. The children were lined up in neat rows, their uniforms pressed, their hair combed, their faces wiped clean of tears. They were told exactly what to say if spoken to and warned of punishments should they falter. Their fear did the work more effectively than threats. No child dared breathe a word of truth. The choir, though smaller now, was rehearsed relentlessly to sing with strength that belied the missing voices. Agnes reminded them that the bishop must see order, not grief, and that their survival depended on their performance. When the bishop arrived, he was greeted with warmth and ceremony. Sister Agnes walked at his side, her smile radiant, her hands folded in humility. She spoke of sacrifice, of her calling to guide orphans into faith and discipline. She led him through the classrooms where children sat upright, their slates perfectly clean, their eyes fixed forward. They recited lessons with steady voices, each word rehearsed until it felt unnatural. The bishop nodded approvingly, remarking on the quietness of the halls, the precision of the students. He praised the sisters for their tireless work, noting how rare it was to find children so obedient, so silent. Agnes bowed her head modestly, though inside she swelled with triumph. The very silence that had been forced through cruelty now stood as proof of holiness in the bishop's eyes. He did not notice the empty beds in the dormitories, for the rows had been rearranged to disguise the gaps. He did not ask why the choir sang hymns that carried sorrow like a funeral dirge. To him, the sound was hauntingly beautiful, evidence of piety rather than trauma. The children sang with trembling voices, their eyes cast downward, and the bishop whispered that they sounded like angels. As he departed, he offered blessings and promises of more funding, convinced that St. Helena's was a model institution. The town celebrated the visit, proud that their academy had impressed the church so thoroughly. No one asked why not a single child ran to the bishop with joy. No one wondered why their smiles never reached their eyes. For Sister Agnes, the inspection was proof that her system worked. She had shown the world only what she wanted it to see. Discipline dressed as holiness, silence dressed as peace, despair dressed as devotion. Evil had not only survived beneath the gaze of authority, it had been praised. And with that blessing, the gates of St. Helena's closed tighter than ever, sealing its horrors deeper into the stone. Long after the bishop's blessing, long after the town had praised St. Helena's for its holiness, the academy's most guarded secret waited in the shadows. It was not in the classrooms or the dormitories, nor even in the chamber below where silence and drowning had been perfected. It was deeper still, hidden behind a locked iron door few ever saw. The sisters called it only the ash room. The room was small, its walls blackened, its ceiling low, but at its center stood the academy's truest heart, a furnace. Its mouth was wide, built of brick and iron, fed by coal shoveled from bins stacked along the wall. The air was thick with soot, clinging to skin, hair, and lungs until breathing felt like swallowing dust. Even when unlit, the furnace carried a smell unlike anything else, the sour, sweet stench of charred flesh that no amount of scrubbing could erase. This was where the vanishings found their end. The children who never returned from the chamber below, the ones the dormitories no longer held, were brought here. Their small bodies were fed to the flames piece by piece until nothing remained but ash. Sometimes rosary beads melted into warped lumps of metal. Sometimes bone fragments resisted the fire, but the sisters crushed them into dust with hammers, scattering them among the ashes until nothing identifiable remained. Sister Agnes considered the furnace her greatest triumph. To her, it was not merely a tool for hiding evidence, but a kind of purification. In her ledgers, she wrote of offering the unworthy to fire, as though burning the children was a ritual sacrifice that cleansed their souls of imperfection. She believed the flames made the academy holy, consuming weakness and leaving only discipline behind. To the other sisters, it was necessity, the only way to silence questions from the town. But to Agnes it was worship. The children who survived never saw the ash room, but they felt it. At night, when the furnace roared, smoke curled upward through hidden vents, seeping into the dormitories. The air grew heavy with the faint sting of burning, and the orphans lay awake, holding their breath against the smell. Some whispered that the smoke carried the voices of the vanished, trapped in ash, drifting through the academy as cries too faint to be heard. Others believed breathing it meant swallowing a piece of the dead, becoming part of their suffering. None dared speak these thoughts aloud, but the terror was shared. Years later, when the academy was finally abandoned, investigators would break through the rusted door and find the ash room preserved in silence. Ash still coated the floor in thick layers, blackened with clumps of bone fragments and twisted bits of metal. Among them lay melted rosaries, their crosses bent and blackened, fused with the remains of the children who once clutched them in prayer. The sight revealed what no ledger could truly capture: the systematic erasure of 73 lives reduced to soot and smoke. For the survivors, the ash room became the final wound, discovered too late for justice, but never too late for grief. They had long suspected where their friends had gone, but seeing the furnace confirmed what they had only dared whisper in the dark. St. Helena's had not only stolen their voices, their songs, their reflections. It had consumed their very bodies, leaving behind nothing but dust scattered through its stones. The town recoiled at the discovery. Families who had once donated turned away in shame. Priests who had praised Sister Agnes refused to speak her name, but the truth could not be buried again. The ash room revealed what hymns and polished smiles had always concealed. St. Helena's was not a place of salvation, but a factory of silence, smoke, and ash. When investigators combed through the ruins of St. Helena's after its closure, they expected only silence and ash. Yet hidden in a locked cabinet in the matron's private study, they found something far more haunting than the furnace: a ledger. Bound in cracked leather, its pages stiff with age, it was filled not with prayers or sermons, but with the systematic catalogue of cruelty. It came to be known simply as the Ledger of Names. At first glance, it resembled any school record. Lines of neat handwriting marked columns for dates, initials, and notes. But the longer the investigators studied, the more its horror revealed itself. Each missing child was there, not with their full name, but with their first letter, reduced to an initial as though their identity had been stripped away even in death. Next to each entry was not a reason, not an adoption notice, but a symbol. A small circle, precise and unbroken, a wave drawn with 3 strokes, a crooked flame. The key to these symbols was found scrawled at the back of the ledger in Agnes's own hand. A circle for silence, a wave for drowning, a flame for ash. Every vanished child was reduced to these marks, their suffering recorded as neatly as attendance. Some pages carried entire rows of circles, meaning groups of children silenced at once. Others bore solitary waves, lone drownings carried out in the coffin below. Still others ended in flames, the children consumed in the furnace that had blackened the ash room walls. 73 symbols in total, 73 fates sealed forever in black ink. The ledger revealed more than numbers. It revealed method. The dates showed patterns, selections made weeks apart, then suddenly in clusters. The order was not random, it was deliberate. as though Agnes were testing her theories in stages, refining her rituals with every group. Silence perfected, drowning refined, burning sanctified. It was cruelty carried out with the precision of a scientist and the devotion of a believer. To the survivors, the ledger was unbearable proof. For years they had carried guilt, wondering if the vanished children had found families or other homes. Now they knew the truth. Their friends had been reduced to circles, waves, and flames, their laughter erased, their names stolen, their lives ended in rituals too cruel for the world to imagine. The survivors wept not only for the dead, but for the way their deaths had been treated as notes in an experiment. For the town, the ledger stripped away every illusion. No longer could they believe the children had been adopted. No longer could they accept the stories told by the sisters. Here was evidence written in the matron's own careful hand, evidence that every disappearance had been known, counted, and planned. It was not neglect. It was not accident. It was design. The ledger of names became the most damning artifact of St. Helena's. Preserved in archives, it carried the weight of 73 children reduced to symbols. Even today, its pages stand as testimony to how evil does not always shout or rage. Sometimes it writes calmly, neatly, recording horrors in ink as though they were lessons to be repeated. The closing of St. Helena's did not come with ceremony. There was no announcement, no farewell to its history. The gates simply rusted shut one year, the classrooms empty, the choir silenced forever. Yet its shadow did not fade. The truth of what had happened within its walls spread slowly at first, then with force, until no corner of the town remained untouched by the story of the 73 children who never left. Survivors, now adults, began to speak in whispers that grew into testimony. Some broke their silence only when confronted with the ledger of names, recognizing the initials of their lost friends. The symbols that explained disappearances they had carried in their memories for decades. One survivor recalled lying awake at night, smelling the smoke and wondering if it was her bunkmate who had vanished the day before. Another remembered the sound of humming stitched through swollen lips, the muffled tones of a friend forced to join the choir until their infection killed them. For the survivors, speaking of these memories meant reliving them, but silence had already stolen enough. Their words poured out like wounds reopening. The town, once proud of the academy, reeled with shame. Families who had donated money or food struggled to reconcile the image of holy sisters with the reality of furnaces and glass coffins. Some refused to believe it at all, dismissing the survivors as bitter, exaggerating, or mistaken. But the evidence could not be denied. The ash room, the ledger, the bones mixed with ash. Eventually, denial gave way to grief. The townspeople realized that they had not merely looked away, they had admired the silence, praised the obedience, and in doing so had become part of the crime. The church faced its own reckoning. Priests who had once praised Sister Agnes fell into defensive silence, unwilling to admit that oversight had failed so completely. But public anger demanded change. Newspapers published stories that spread beyond the town until state officials launched inquiries into orphanages across the region. Laws were rewritten to require inspections, records, and accountability where before there had been only trust. St. Helena's became the case whispered in legislative halls. the name invoked when officials insisted that no child should ever disappear again without answer. For the families of the vanished, there were no bodies to bury, no graves marked with names, only ash, swept and scattered, left behind in the furnace where their children had been consumed. To fill the void, the town raised a memorial near the academy's gates. 73 stones were set in a circle, each carved only with the year 1873 and the word orphan. No names could be restored, for the ledger had stolen them. But the circle became a place where people gathered to grieve. Survivors stood there too, leaving small tokens. A ribbon, a scrap of cloth, a wooden toy carved in silence. The memorial was not enough, but it was something, a defiance against the erasure that Agnes had so carefully planned. Over time, the ruins of the academy decayed. Weeds grew between the stones, the roof collapsed in places, and birds nested where children had once wept. Yet those who visited spoke of a heaviness that lingered, as though the walls still carried the echoes of hymns sung in broken voices. Some said the silence felt alive, pressing against the ears, reminding every visitor that what had been done there could never truly be erased. The legacy of St. Helena's was not only in the past. It lived in every institution built afterward, in every law that demanded accountability, in every whisper that reminded parents to ask questions, to count the children, to never confuse silence with peace. It lived in the survivors who carried scars invisible to the eye, who passed their stories down so that forgetting would never be an option. And it lived in the unanswered question. How many other gates had closed across the world, hiding cruelties just as carefully behind smiles just as polished? The ruins of St. Helena's stand today as little more than stone and iron swallowed by weeds, yet they speak louder than any living witness. To walk past its broken gates is to feel a silence that does not comfort but accuses, as though the air itself remembers what the world once ignored. 73 children entered these walls with hope, each carrying the smallest dream of safety. None of them walked out. What makes St. Helena's most terrifying is not only the cruelty inflicted, but the quiet way it thrived. Evil here was not loud, not wild, not a frenzy of violence. It was calm, methodical, disguised as holiness. It wore habits of black and white. It smiled in public. It prayed in chapel light. It lived in ledgers written with careful handwriting and in hymns sung for visitors who mistook despair for devotion. It lived in silence, a silence praised by outsiders, enforced by the sisters, endured by the children until it consumed them completely. The ledger of names proved that cruelty can be systematic, neat, and orderly. Each child reduced to a symbol, their suffering catalogued like entries in a book. The ashroom proved that erasure can be final, that evidence of life can be reduced to smoke. The choir proved that even voices can be stolen and twisted into tools for deception. And the glass coffin proved that innocence can be forced to watch itself die. None of this happened in chaos. It happened in order. The legacy of St. Helena's forces us to confront a truth many wish to ignore. Evil does not always arrive with chaos or fire. More often it hides in institutions we trust, in leaders we admire, in smiles we mistake for kindness. It survives because it does not look like a monster. It survives because it looks like normalcy, like order, like holiness. It survives because silence protects it. When the survivors finally spoke decades later, their words carried the weight of everything silence had stolen. They described fear that never left them, voices that never healed, reflections they could no longer face. Some carried scars in their bodies, others in their dreams. All carried the knowledge that the world had believed Sister Agnes's smile more than their cries. The memorial near the gate stands as both tribute and warning. Visitors leave flowers, prayers, and sometimes only silence, struggling to find words for what words can never hold. The circle of stones is small compared to the magnitude of loss, yet it forces each passerby to confront a question. How many other St. Helenas have existed, their stories buried, their children erased? We live in a world where institutions still demand trust, where silence is still mistaken for obedience, where smiles still hide truth. The story of St. Helena's is not only history, it is a mirror. It asks us to look closely at the places we call safe, at the people we call holy, at the silences we praise. It asks us to remember that evil often grows not in chaos but in quiet, not in rebellion but in obedience. The 73 children of St. Helena's never graduated, never saw the world beyond its iron gates, never had their names carved in stone. But their absence carved something else, a scar on history, a warning etched into memory. Their story is not only about what was lost, but about what silence can cost when we mistake it for peace. The camera lingers on the ruins one last time, the wind pressing through broken windows, carrying nothing but quiet. And then the question left hanging for every listener, every viewer. What do you think? Could this happen again?